Hello, this is Jonathan Lampel here from Blender HD, and in this tutorial I'm going to be going over how to fracture wood. So in the last tutorials I showed you how to shatter glass, different kinds of glass, and also showed you how to shatter complex objects while getting clean fractures. I've got a little preview here of what we're going to be doing. You can see here that this block is set up as wood, even without materials or anything. Hopefully you can easily tell that, it's of some sort of wood material. Maybe it's not perfect, but it's pretty close. And tweaking the settings, you'll be able to set it up however way you wish. But the cool thing is that it's since it's using bullet physics, if you have a low mass or have a low mass on the ball hitting the wood, it's going to fracture into larger chunks. With the smaller ones at the point of fracture. But if you set this up to say 250. It's going to create lots of smaller chunks and completely tear through it. So this is definitely the power of using constraints. I'll be showing you how to be setting up constraints using the constraints bullet constraints add-on, which I'll link to in the description below. So you can go and download that and install it. And yeah, I'm just going to start a new file here. Okay, real quick, I'm going to change my theme so you can easily follow along, so nothing's confusing to you at all. Okay, so let's get started. What I'm going to do here is I'm just going to make a beam of sorts, and so just like in the preview I showed you, I'm just going to scale this on the z-axis maybe 3 times. Scale it up. Maybe I want it a little bit thinner, so I'll scale Shift Z, scale it in. About there, that looks good. And what I did to create the fractures that were all jagged, it took me a while to figure out exactly how to do that, but a good way is to add a plane. Make sure it's about the same size, doesn't have to be perfect, maybe a little bit bigger. And then I'm going to go into edit mode. Let me turn on screencast keys here so you can follow along. And I'm going to hit W and subdivide. But then if I hit F6, use that menu, I'm going to set the number of cuts all the way to 10. And looks like I actually changed the fractal instead. So you can go here in the toolkit. Or, no, that's just what I had previously. Okay, so I changed the number of subdivisions to 10. And I upped the fractal. I don't want it overlapping like that. That's awful, but I can just set that to 0.5 and it'll give me a nice roughness. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to scale along the z-axis to give me this kind of spiky effect. And, it looks awful topology-wise. It's definitely nasty, but we want, jagged cuts for the wood material because that's how wood splinters. So that's what I'm going to do. And then, again, in edit mode, I'm just going to Shift D and duplicate this. Couple more times, rotate it 90 degrees on the z-axis, maybe duplicate it up here, rotate 90 degrees on the z-axis negative, so you just get lots of different variations. And just like in the other tutorials, I'm going to have that selected, shift select the object we want fractured, press Ctrl P and parent to object. So hopefully I'm not going too fast, but all of this we already covered in the other videos, so I'm not going to go through it again. So if you're having trouble following along, then just start at the beginning and work your way up here. So like previously, I'm going to press Shift S and cursor to selected to put it right there. I don't necessarily like how it's so low, so I kind of want it fractured up there, so that looks good. And then I'm going to select this and go to Cell Fracture. Alright, so in Cell Fracture, again, like previously, I'm going to choose Child Vertices, but here I'm going to up this to say 500. You might want it a little bit more, but the reason is you need lots of large chunks, and I'm going to enable Own Vertices as well. Actually, no, sorry about that, never mind. You might want to set this to 750 or something if your computer can handle it. Because what it'll give you is more jagged edges the higher you set this. So say if you set this to 10, you're not going to get as jagged as if, if you set it really high. So the last step here is to make sure that you set this here. It says scale really faintly, but if you set this to 0.1, it'll create jagged edges up and down. So think of this as x, y, and z coordinates. And so if you set this, really low, you can't set it any more than 1, by the way. It's just 0 to 1. And the lower you set this, the more stretched out it's going to be on that axis. And since we want these kind of stretched up and down to give us the wood grain, I'm going to set this to 0.1, and it's going to stretch it out on the axis. Alright, so I'm going to leave the noise at 0, put the recursion to 1, cursor close, 0.5, and like previously, set that to 0, and yeah, we should be good. So since I set it to 500, it'll take a few more minutes than before, but hopefully not too long. And you can see here that it's, definitely stretching it on the z-axis more than normally, and if I would have set this to say 750 or 1000, you'd get even more stretching just because there's more points to cram into that space. Okay, I think it's almost done. I think I said this before, but clamp recursion, what that does is it just kind of ends your recursion after a certain point. So the reason we turned it to 0 here is that, if you don't set it high enough, it's going to stop completely, and you're going to have long jagged objects that are not fractured, or do not get the recursion, and then you're going to have ones right next to it that do. And so I just set this to 0 to disable it. So this isn't really setting the limit to 0, it's disabling it completely. I don't think there's too many other settings to go over here. Physics mass mode, I haven't quite figured that out because I think it's only works with the game engine. It doesn't actually apply the mass in the viewport bullet physics. Don't quote me on that because I don't actually know that for sure. Object recenter here, what that does is it recenters the object origin to the center of mass, which is definitely handy because you're going to need that because the rigid bodies calculate the center of mass based on the object origin. So if you don't check this, then it's going to have all of your object origins be right at the middle of the original object, and so they're all going to be rotating weird and definitely not what you want. Layer index, it just puts it on whichever layer you want. Next layer obviously puts it on the next layer. Group is really handy. I actually probably should have done that, but what this does is it allows you to make all of these shards into a group. So if I wanted to name this wood, then I could go into the group select and select the group wood really easily in the outliner without having to go and individually box select and deselect certain ones, and that would be really handy. Unfortunately I didn't do that, and I don't really want to refactor this because it's taking longer than I thought. So yeah, I think I'll just pause the mic and wait for a little bit and see you in a few. Okay, so that didn't take too long. So put the fractures on the next layer, and you can see here that it just kind of fractured it straight up and down. And that's what we want. It's more dense in the center where we want it to be fractured, and it's all good. One thing to check for is really like box-like objects that are fractured. It'll give you some weird box that's added to it and you need to delete. In this case we don't have any, which is good, but it's always good to check just in case, because sometimes it'll really mess things up. Okay, so now all I'm going to do is press Shift S, cursor to center. Shift A, add a cube, scale it on the Z-axis, scale Shift Z, scale it up a bit, make that a passive rigid body, and take all of these, make sure one of them is selected as the active object, go over here to rigid body tools and add active, and if you play this back, it's a little bit slower than normal because there's quite a lot of objects. But what's going on is you're getting these kind of shards that are going through the floor, and that's definitely not good. You never want that. So an easy way to fix that is just turn on collision margin. But if you do that, then it's going to all explode because they're obviously closer than 0.04 units. So just turn that down to 0, and then copy from active, and that should work well. So you're getting some a very little bit, but that'll be easily fixed through iterations and such. And yeah, you see here it's pushing things through, but again, that has to do with iterations, and as long as you're not getting the little pointy sticks that are rolling around, then you should be fine for now. Okay, so now I'm going to enable deactivation and start deactivated. Copy. Nope, don't want to do that, that's for sure. Copy from active. So if I play this back, nothing happens because nothing's interacting with it, which is perfect. What I'm going to do now is add a UV sphere, or good old bullet or soccer ball, whatever you want it to be. I'm just going to shade it smooth because it looks nicer that way. Doesn't actually matter. And like before, I'm going to insert a keyframe right there, and then about frame 10, insert a keyframe right there, make it a rigid body, active, hover over this and press I, so it's not animated at frame 10, it's animated at frame 9. Okay, so we've been through all that before, and if we play it back, it's gonna bounce off because it has no mass. But even if it didn't have mass and it was bouncing off the wood, this wouldn't be really realistic because it wouldn't just bounce off and cause the entire thing to collapse. That's like, kicking a 4-story building and having it fall on you. It's not going to happen. So the way we're going to fix this is with constraints. And what that's going to do is going to keep certain objects together. And yeah, you'll see as we get into it. So there is a add-on called Bullet Constraints Tools, which I'll put a link to in the description below, and you'll be able to go and download it. And yeah, it's really, really handy. So the way we're going to use this on the wood is we're just going to deselect that, make sure the wood is selected, and make sure it's the active object. And then I'm going to hit X constraints. And this is also going to take a couple minutes because what it does is it creates a constraint in between, or a constraint for every single object. And since we have a lot of objects, it's going to have to create a lot of constraints. And this can be kind of slow because things like self-fracture and bullet constraints tools are not multi-threaded. Add-ons aren't multi-threaded, and I don't even know if, I guess physics kind of are. That's a gray area. I'm not really sure about that, but it will take longer even if you have a really powerful computer. It'll still take at least a little bit, not too long. And yeah, I'll pause the mic so you don't have to sit the way through this, but it shouldn't be too long now. Okay, basically right when I paused the mic, then it fixed it. Okay, so I'm going to save this file because it would kind of suck if it stopped now and have to redo all that. So I'm just going to go into videos, tutorials, fracture wood fracture.blend. Okay, now it's all saved and we're all good to go. So if we play this back, it's definitely a lot slower, and you can see what happens is the enable deactivation was turned off. This happens when you apply or add the constraints. It's just something that happens. The developer is working on fixing that, but it's really easy to work around, so I'll definitely fix that here in a second. See, another thing that happens is that after the ball hits it, it doesn't affect the wood at all. It's staying together, so that's very good. So just to fix the enable deactivation, I'm just going to select one of these, enable deactivation, and copy from active. And that should fix it. So you can see the ball hits it, it kind of jiggles a little bit, and it falls down, and then the pressure causes these constraints to kind of buckle, and it falls over. And before you go and update any of these settings, what you have to do is go into the groups visibility and select rigid body constraints to make sure that they're selected, or else, when you update, this isn't going to do anything. Okay, so a few things that we should fix here are, you can see that, when we play this back, it doesn't really break. It just kind of hits and bounces off. We want it to break. So what we have to do here is enable, nope, not iterations. We're going to enable breakable constraints, and we definitely want a heavier ball. So instead of the mass of 1, I'm going to set that to 100, and we'll play it back and see how that goes. Hits the wall, breaks some constraints. You can see it just kind of tears through it, and that's because the threshold is set to 10. The lower we set this, the easier it's going to break. But it really is kind of a cool effect. It's like it is actually tearing wood. So, if you need that, then you can go ahead and, set that lower or set the mass lower, whichever works for you, and you will get that nice tearing wood effect. So, that looks pretty good. But I want the ball to go through. I want it to shatter. So I'm going to set this to 3. Oh, remember you have to have the rigid body constraints selected. Set that to 3, update selected, play it back again. See, now it's actually breaking, but unlike before where it just kind of fell down, there are pieces that are being held together, and that is definitely what we want. So maybe I want it a little bit more than that, but not much. That looks perfect for now. Forgot to update selected. Okay, that looks good. I like that. That looks great, because you can see it's bending the wood, it's splintering it, and you have little shards going everywhere. But you have the stuff that's kind of being stuck together, and it just looks good. It looks like wood. Maybe if you had more shards, it would be a little bit longer splinters, but overall that looks like wood. So, a few things. I'm going to go over the constraints tool, which I didn't necessarily need here, but you might need it in your scene depending on how you're setting it up. So, the search radius, if you set this up, the little tooltip here says near search radius. Not really helpful since that's the name of the option, but what it does is it has the radius in units of how far it searches for a neighbor to stick to. The higher you set this, the more clumping it's going to get. Usually if I need a stiff object, I'm going to set this really, really high, up to 100, whatever. Neighbor limit limits the number of neighbors that a fracture can have. So say, one in the middle can only be connected to 3 surrounding ones, but those 3 surrounding ones are connected to other 3 surrounding ones, so they all do stick together. But if you have trouble with things not sticking together quite right, you might want to increase this, which will make it a lot slower, but not a ton, and it could improve your result a lot depending on what you're doing. The last thing that I'll go over is override iterations. Sometimes you'll get a piece of wood. Maybe say if I changed this here to 1, play this back. Yeah, you can't even see it here, but in some cases you'll get something that looks really bouncy. It looks like it's kind of rubber, and that's definitely not what you want. You definitely want it to be wood to be stiff until it's broken. So what you can do here is you can override iterations and set this to say 100 or 150. and that should, combined with a better search radius and maybe some neighbor limit, then that'll fix it well. And so that's pretty much how to fracture wood. One last thing is, say this is a support beam on a house, and it's connected to the ground, and we don't really want it to be uprooted there, because those are going everywhere, but we want those to be stuck in the ground. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hide the constraints for now. Go back to the first frame. I'm going to select these bottom ones here, and then I'm going to shift select the ground plane. And now what I can do is I can hit ground connect, and that's going to connect these two with constraints. So you can see if I unhide that, it's added some constraints connecting them to the floor, and that'll basically connect those objects to the ground so that when I play this back, you can see it disabled the forgot what it was called. Deactivation. It disabled the deactivation, but that's okay. But you can see that it just kind of keeps those objects at the center. It can break like all the other ones, but that's just what it does, and it can be really handy for keeping a post in place or whatever. And I think that's it. I hope you learned a lot about constraints, fracturing wood, making it look realistic, and you definitely want to make sure that even before you apply materials, that it looks like the kind of material that you're going for. So here, wood has is split along the grain, so you're going to get these long and jagged edges, which is totally different than glass, totally different than concrete, and totally different than brick. And yeah, thank you for watching. I will be going over concrete next, and then brick. So if you like this video, then don't be afraid to like the video. If you thought it was awful, then dislike the video. And if you want more tutorials, then feel free to subscribe. So again, thank you for watching, and have a good day.